Good evening, everybody. I'd like to thank Rabbi Trump and Rabbi Shire for the opportunity to share some Torah with you on this wonderful Yontiv of Chanukah. As many of you know, I teach Mishnayos at the Young Israel of Lawrence-Cedarhurst, and for many years I've been intrigued by Mishnayos. And one of the more intriguing questions I find that relates to Mishnayos is the lack of discussion of the halachos of Chanukah in the Mishnah. This is a very famous question, it's not mine, and many terutzim and many answers are given why it is that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi left out the Yontiv of Chanukah from the halachos. We find Purim is there, obviously Pesach and Shabbos and Rosh Hashanah and all the other Yom Tov and Sukkos. But why is Chanukah left out? But that's not the point of tonight's discussion, because in fact, if you take a closer look, you will find that there are in fact 8 Mishnayos throughout Shisha Sidrei Mishnah that mention Chanukah and ancillary halachos related to Chanukah. And so tonight I'd like to discuss the final Mishnah. If you were to take them in order of Shisha Sidrei Mishnah, the final Mishnah to mention Chanukah is found in Baba Kama, Perek Vav, Mishnah Vav. It is a particularly famous Mishnah. The Mishnah there is discussing the damages and in particular the case of a camel that is laden with flax and the flax catches on fire. Who's responsible? And the Mishnah says that if the camel is walking in the Rishus Harabim, in the public thoroughfare, and its flax enters into a store and catches on fire from a lantern that's inside a store, then obviously the owner of the camel is responsible. However, if the storekeeper places the lantern outside and then it causes a fire, obviously the storekeeper is responsible for any damages. However, the Mishnah concludes with a case of what happens if the candle that is placed outdoors by the storekeeper is one of the Ner Chanukah, it's the menorah, and then it causes a fire with the flax on the camel. So according to Rabbi Yehuda, you are patur, you are not obligated to pay for the damages, and most of the Mefarshim understand this to be because, in fact, you have permission to place your fire outside. You have a permission to place the Chanukiah outside. Because the space outside by your doorstep is set aside for the mitzvah, and it's kind of what we would call protected space for the performance of a mitzvah. And so what I would suggest is that according to Rabbi Yehuda, as we'll see, that space outside is no longer what you would call Rishus Harabim, but it's called a makom mitzvah. It's a place where a mitzvah is meant to be performed. I would like to suggest that actually Rabbi Yehuda is Rabbi Yehuda is in line with his own view found in another Mishnah. This Mishnah can be found in Maisros, Perek Gimel, Mishnah Gimel. The halacha when it comes to produce and when you're gathering produce from your fields, at some point it's going to, in Eretz Yisrael especially, you're going to be obligated to take off Trumos and Maisros before you start to eat it. However, there is a point in time where you're allowed to eat what's called B'derech Arai. You can have an occasional snack of the fruits while, let's say, in the fields. In fact, my wife and I, back in February, were in Eretz Yisrael soon after October 7th, and we were zocha one day to go to the south, where we assisted a farmer in picking oranges off of his tree. And then at some moment we realized that, in fact, according to this halacha, we don't have to worry about trumos and maisros, and we were able to eat an orange or two as we were picking them off the tree, and they were delicious, of course. So, but the question is, at what point in the production cycle do you have to stop eating, and then and first have to take off trumos and maisros? So the halacha is that when the produce enters into your house, into a permanent structure, at that point you first have to take off trumos maisros. You can no longer snack on the fruits, but rather you have to first give trumos and maisros. So our Mishnah in Meseftas Maisros discusses a series of structures that are either temporary or semi-permanent, and whether or not those would qualify to trigger the obligation to first give trumos and maisros, to cut off your ability to snack on the fruit and to first give trumos and maisros. So after providing a series of temporary structures, the Mishnah concludes with the question of, what about a sukkah on Sukkos? You have a sukkah that we build every year for the 8 days of Sukkos, 7 days of Sukkos, right? And then the question is, what's the status of that sukkah during the Chag of Sukkos? So the Chachamim say it does not work to trigger the obligation to give Trumos and Maisros, because it's not a structure that's meant to be up all year. It's meant for a small portion of the year, and therefore it does not trigger the obligation. On the other hand, Rabbi Yehuda argues, and he rules otherwise. And he says that if fruit were to enter, fruit that it was not, Trumas and Maasros were not yet taken, are brought into a sukkah on Sukkos, that will in fact trigger the obligation to give Trumos and Maasros prior to you eating any further of that fruit. So the Gemara in Yuma, when discussing this Mishnah, tries to create a machlokus between Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim whether or not a sukkah has to be what's called a diras arai or a dias kva. Is it a temporary structure or does it have to be a more permanent structure? And that's a machlokus that the Gemara in Yuma discusses, but that I will leave that for now. What I would like to suggest, which is based upon a read of both the Mishnah here and the Mishnah in Baba Kama, is that according to Rabbi Yehuda, just like a Ner Chanukah, the space outside your home becomes a makom of a mitzvah and it transforms that space. A sukkah during sukkah, similarly, where you're performing a mitzvah and effectively and essentially changes the very nature of the space itself. Think of a shul or a beis medrash, right? Those places are makom kadosh, and they're inherently different spaces than your typical home. By being a makom of a mitzvah, the sukkah becomes, by definitionally, I would suggest, it becomes a makom kavah, and thereby triggering the Meiser requirement. Whether it's the Ner Chanukah or the sukkah, by the fact that you are performing a mitzvah with that space, it's no longer a mundane space, but it's a space filled with purpose and a space filled with kedusha. Like I said, it's definitionally no longer a Rosh Hashanah. It's no longer just a temporary dwelling, but it's a sukkah, it's a makom mitzvah, it's a makom of Ner Chanukah. Rabbi Yehuda sees that, I would suggest that Rabbi Yehuda sees that there is a way to transform the spaces around us. And I found it very interesting that both Chanukah and Sukkot, especially as performed in Eretz Yisrael, are mitzvos that are outside our homes, where we take the kedusha of our Torah and our mitzvos from their protective cocoon of our homes or our stores or our personal spaces, and we bring them outside, where we let the kedusha shine and surround us, so that even when we are vulnerable to the outside influences, perhaps a less Torah-dik environment, a place where it's harder to do mitzvos, we know that the kedusha is still with us. Hence, Rabbi Yehuda says that in both of these cases, the mitzvah will transform that space into a different space completely. It's not just the outside space. It's not just a sukkah on my porch in the backyard, but it's a different, inherently different space itself. If these mitzvahs have the power to transform the outside space, how much more so does it have, especially here in Gullus, where we light our menorahs typically inside our homes? Think about how much more it can influence ourselves inside our homes, where we can let the Kedusha permeate our homes, shedding light on how to fill our homes with Torah and mitzvos. And we should be taking the opportunity of the Ner Chanukah, where we have the time to say Tehillim, we have the time to learn a little Torah in front of those candles, we have a time to reflect on the nisim and the flows that HaKadosh Baruch Hu did for us in those times and in these times, and everything that's been happening to Klal Yisrael. We can reflect on that in our own homes, where we feel safe, and bring that Kedusha to the outside world. And with that, we should be zochet to bring the light of Torah and mitzvos to the outside world with the coming of Mashiach Tzidkenu B'meher V'yameinu. Amen. And with wishes for a wonderful, wonderful Hanukkah.